So I'm Britta Rosenheim. I'm a partner at Better Food Ventures. We have Stefan Kalib, who is the founder and CEO of Shelf Engine. Do you want to just start about your kind of broad overview about what Shelf Engine currently does and what problem it's solving?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks for having me, Britta. I appreciate being here. So Shelf Engine very simply replaces the buyer at a grocery store. What we look to do at a grocery store is say, hey, can we make a better decision than a human can? Therefore reducing waste and increasing sales in a grocery store setting. Now, kind of the twist on what we do and how we actually make money is like a grocery buyer, we actually take inventory risk. So if the product doesn't sell, the grocer doesn't pay for it. We do. But for doing that, we actually make a margin on the product.
And so I've followed your trajectory kind of over the years from your initial concept, which is focused on waste reduction and efficient buying, to where you are now, which has the same purpose, but you had to approach it a different way. Do you want to talk about, the vision that you had in starting the company, your first approach, and kind of the iterations after?
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks for asking. So, originally what we saw was, hey, let's build some artificial intelligence that's going to be able to outperform a human in terms of a buying decision. When we actually went and developed this, and we got to a point where we said, hey, we can way outperform a human, we can radically reduce waste. And we had a solution here. A solution is very different than a business model. And what we realized in this particular case was, hey, we've got this technology solution, but there's a lot of barriers for us to actually just sell it as a straight technology platform to the grocer.
So take one step back in terms of, just helping flesh it out a little bit in terms of who your clients are. Yep. So what are you targeting? What particular products are you, just to frame that?
Yep, great question. So what we look for is mostly the highly perishables, right? So if you look at a grocery store today and you kind of segment it into three parts, you have produce, center aisle, and deli. Center aisle, first of all, it's under attack by Amazon. Every footprint in grocery store is kind of getting smaller and smaller in terms of center aisle. But frankly speaking, if you overstock in terms of canned foods, you're eventually going to get through them. Stock out is costly to you, but in general, highly perishables like produce and deli items are way harder to predict how much to actually stock. We like, and our sweet spot is items from about a 1-day shelf life to a 45-day shelf life. So the short,
went that high.
Yeah, so anywhere from juices that are 45 days to artisan bread that is 1-day shelf life. Fairly hard to predict, and the waste percentage is really high in terms of the grocery stores. You may not realize this, but oftentimes when you walk through a grocery store and you walk through the deli section, you look in those products, we're talking about 30% waste on a lot of those products, right? So that's really where there's a massive amount of optimization that can be done.
And how did you see this initial do you want to give a little bit on your background?
Sure, absolutely.
The tech?
Yeah, totally. So I actually built a food company. 10 years ago, I started a grab-and-go food company that worked primarily with grocery stores, corporate cafeterias. And we were delivering, and we're actually managing the inventory for all these locations. We actually grew quite a bit, got into hundreds and hundreds of retail locations across the West Coast, and became a really interesting problem for us to actually predict how much we were going to stock of each one of these items. That's what got me fascinated with this problem. That's what got me to see that, hey, in the industry, this is something that is just not being solved. Yep. So we got really excited about it.
And there are solutions that are focused in the center of the grocer. So I think a lot of people, when they think about optimized purchasing, they think, isn't that even figured out with all the ERP solutions? Isn't it, we have many, many years of technology that have been focused on the center of the grocery store. Do you want to talk about, kind of just initial problem and approach that the deli managers and, the fruits and vegetable managers are, what are they using now? What are the solutions they're using now? Obviously not universally, but from what you've seen in terms of standard practices.
Yep. So the majority of the technology solutions that you'll see in grocery stores today are ERPs that are built in with the actual point of sale system in there. So like one of the massive ones is ECRS, right? So they have an entire solution for the entire grocery store, everything from receiving to the actual point of sale system. Now, a lot of these technology solutions are built for center aisle because the evolution of the grocery store was essentially they eventually tacked on deli and tacked on produce, which in the 50s were 3 different locations that you went and purchased from. So a lot of the systems are built for inventory instead of actually looking at things that are fresh food where you have a high turn rate in those situations. So what you'll commonly see in those grocery stores is they'll use their ERP solution throughout the grocery store, But in the highly perishables, the grocery managers are usually using spreadsheets or pieces of paper to actually predict how much they're going to stock.
When walking the floor on a daily basis. Yeah,
walking the floor. I mean, there's some great stories out there of some folks that I talked to very high up in the grocery world, and they say, hey, one of our most common methods of doing things is walk the floor, look for holes in the shelves, and that's how we reorder.
Yeah.
And that is fairly common, even for the kind of the multi-billion-dollar chains out there.
And so your initial approach into solving this problem, so as you said, a technology solution isn't necessarily a business plan, but on top of that, a technology solution, there's certain expectations that you have in terms of the partners and or the customers, clients that you'd be working with. That I recall you telling me, there's some platforms that aren't. Most platforms you can't plug into. So, your first error in assumptions.
Right. Yeah. Thanks for bringing us back to that point, because I think it's a really interesting and important point. Is that when we first launched, what we were hoping to do is be able to rely on the data set from the grocery stores. And what we noticed and what we observed was that the data coming through the point of sale system was not good enough for us to be able to rely on. So if you want to make some big overarching data conclusions, sort of like sales trends as a whole, you can rely on that kind of data. But if you're actually trying to make predictions down to the piece, down to that item, to that specific day, you need way more reliable data.
Yep.
So we realized that our first problem was that data in terms of receiving at a store and data in terms of sales that are actually going through the point of sale system were not good enough for us to actually be able to rely on. So that was our main.
And so in essence, there's a disconnect between, in terms of receiving from the vendors and the grocer, in terms of how many items are being picked up, how many are in great condition, and so forth. Is that kind of one of the initial issues?
There's a massive problem there. So one of the first things we discovered that close to a fifth to a quarter of the deliveries that are happening, the vendor and the retailer don't agree on that initially. What tends to happen is the vendor just says, oh, okay, we'll just credit you that amount, or we'll just adjust it, whatever you say it is.
Yeah.
But there's a great discrepancy in terms of the agreement there, which, on the data side of things makes it very hard once you start having that discrepancy to make predictions.
Right, because the foundational assumption in terms of how many units that you're even starting with is fluctuating or different, so it's hard to optimize on that.
Exactly,
yeah.
Exactly, which is a key point. So that was one of the first things we addressed, was actually when the delivery happens, the delivery driver and the person at the dock both have to agree on technology level right away in terms of what's actually there.
And that's through the Shelf Engine platform?
That is through the Shelf Engine platform, yep, exactly.
And so in terms of, I think the other piece is, kind of DOS platforms. I think it'd be good. I think, there's a lot of sophistication that we see, as a consumer, in terms of interacting on e-commerce and grocers. I think it's widely recognized that grocers are obviously usually a couple cycles behind the general kind of retail trends, but there's the assumption that there still is a lot of technology on the back end. Do you want to talk a little bit about that challenge?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a really large challenge for grocers in general, but also for distributors. They've made a major migration, like 20 years ago, into some of these big platforms. A huge amount of data is reliant there. You'll notice today still, distributors will come and deliver an invoice, and it's on a dot matrix printer, where you're literally pulling off the little holes. It's still fairly common. It's really hard to be able to migrate from one of these platforms to something new. I've toured so many facilities there where you still see the black screen with the green letters, and they don't even have a mouse, and that's how they're actually running their purchasing. So we realized that if we ever wanted to plug into any sort of those data platforms, that it was going to be a very large challenge for us. So we decided to go ahead and leapfrog that completely. So we give the system for the vendor to be completely reliant on Shelf Engine, as the grocer as well. They can plug in their systems if they want to, but they don't have to, and that was one of the key things we discovered.
And so, in terms of, kind of from the lens of the grocer or the small retailer that's using Shelf Engine, how are they utilizing it on a daily basis?
Yeah, so most of our customers do use it every single day. The reason is, in the food industry, there's this concept of a standing order, which means it's basically a reoccurring order with a weekly template. And a lot of the products that we have on there either get delivered every day or every other day. And so what happens is the driver delivers the product, they agree on the dock what's been delivered, goes stocks on a shelf, and then at the end of every day, the grocer notes what hasn't sold. So we have a true waste log for all these products, and we credit the store for all those products. So what's really cool about what we have at shelf is that we know exactly what's been delivered every day and what's been wasted every day. So we have way greater insight than the store actually has on its own, because the stores have traditionally very much failed to actually account for their waste themselves. So we get to see a really cool picture on that side of things.
And so then how are you using that data?
Yeah, so what we do is we plug in that data right now into our artificial intelligence. It predicts how much to stock for the next day and so forth. There are some really interesting opportunities that have been popping up. For example, now we have all this data in terms of when the product is wasted at the end of every day for all these stores. Where could we possibly use that data? Could we start feeding it to the food banks to tell them exactly where the right product is to go picked up? And as we continue to reduce that waste, we can see where the optimization really is in terms of that store. Yeah.
And how do you on the vendor side, kind of how do they see this opportunity? Is this kind of increased digitization into the grocer? Is this yet one more kind of program they're interacting with? I guess it'd be helpful to understand kind of what value you're offering to the vendors and how do they utilize these insights?
Yeah, and that's a great question. We tend to replace what the vendor's doing currently, which is using a bunch of spreadsheets.
Okay.
So what we're doing is a lot of times vendors, they have a burden on them to actually guarantee sales sometimes. And so they're very happy to be able to go ahead and give that away and be done with that process. So we tend to replace their technology stack on the front end there.
And so how do you think, I think we're running out of time, but I think just, I've seen kind of a number of iterations over the last couple of years. It's been exciting to see you grow. How do you think about the next 12 months in terms of either the evolution of the product or your approach or kind of your client base? Yeah,
so we're obviously growing really fast right now, and we're adding grocers, pretty much new grocers every week at this point, and new vendors every week onto the platform. So that's a really exciting part. In terms of technology, some of the exciting things that we're going to start seeing is what's happening with RFID specifically, and what's happening with image recognition. So the more data that we can get in the store, we can actually use it. So that's some really exciting stuff that I think we'll see in the next 12 months pop up.
Great. Well, I appreciated my time with you.
Yeah,
Thanks.
absolutely. Thank you.